Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, an open conversation on science, policy, and advocacy. This webinar is co-hosted with Union of Concerned Scientists, a national nonprofit dedicated to using rigorous, independent science to solve our planet's biggest problems and most pressing problems. UCS is also a longtime collaborator with SACNAS. We're super excited to have you here today. And so to really kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Melissa Varga, Science Network Community and Partnerships Manager at Union of Concerned Scientists. Take it away, Melissa.
Thank you, Daniela. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you. And joining me today, we have Jorge and Albert. Jorge, the self-identified Mayan bioengineer who is first inspired to get involved in science policy at a SACNAS conference, and he'll tell you more about that. And Albert will be talking a little bit more about his background as a SACNAS chapter leader and now working in science policy. All right, so to kick things off today, I just wanted to share some learning objectives. So hopefully you will leave today's discussion with an understanding of the multiple different paths to engage in policy advocacy, some tools to help you think through which path or paths seem like a good fit for you, ways to think about your role of identity in advocacy and engagement. We'll share a list of resources so you can continue to learn and get involved in policy as you continue to get more involved in this space, and then a few action opportunities so you can get involved right away. And I wanted to start off today with some definitions. So there are two angles to science policy. First, there's policy for science, and this is the backbone that allows scientists to do their work. So a lot of this is around increasing funding or supporting funding for scientific research, but it also includes things like scientific integrity protections in government to make sure that scientists can do their work. And then there's science for policy. And this is about using science to inform decisions like legislation and regulations that protect our health and safety. So things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, laws like the recent Inflation Reduction Act, which included mandates and funding for things like clean energy. This is science for policy. And these two pieces reinforce each other. Science policy overall is strengthened when science is playing a role in both of these ways. So that's policy. Let's talk about advocacy. I use a very simple definition of advocacy. It's the act or process of supporting a cause or proposal. So marching for science is advocacy, and writing to your governor in support of LGBTQ rights is advocacy, but so is putting a sticker on your laptop that says science is real. That can be advocacy as well. And we need advocacy because data and research don't speak for themselves. Only people can speak for science and research, and people come with their own values and biases and assumptions. And that's why we say that although science isn't partisan, science is political, because the decisions about what gets researched, what gets funding, how is data shared? All of these questions are ultimately based in power. Who has it? How is it being distributed? Who holds it? And who are they influenced by? And I bring all of this up because I want you to understand where I'm coming from, bringing this into the discussion today. And because I think thinking about the distribution of power is a really important lens when you're thinking about using science to create change. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here in policy and advocacy. Another value that I want to share with you is that scientists are constituents as well. You're not just researchers in a lab. And because everyone is a constituent, you have the right to talk to your elected officials and decision makers about science-based, equitable policymaking. Even if you're not a citizen, you are still a constituent of the decision makers who represent your area, so you have a right to make your voice heard. Given the current political climate that we're in, the recent Supreme Court decisions about affirmative action on one hand, and legislation, on the other hand, like the CHIPS Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which put tons of funding and support into science and innovation. Now is a really important time to think about the different ways that you can bring your knowledge and research and interests into policy advocacy. So, what are some ways that you can do that? Well, I want to share a quick video that highlights science policy careers. And although this is focused on careers, these paths have equivalents, so you can engage in them as a volunteer at a much lower level than turning it into a full career. So check out this very short video, and then I'll offer a few more tips before passing it on to Jorge.
Science policy means informing decisions that affect our everyday lives. This broad, fast-growing field offers many ways to get involved. Let's explore some science policy career paths and what they can look like. Maybe the most obvious path that comes to mind is working directly on policy or legislation, whether that's through Congress or in state or local government, or working for a third party like a lobbying firm. Working directly on policy requires deep familiarity with a broad range of science and engineering issues, plus an understanding of how the policy-making process works. Policy writing skills are very important here. Science policy fellowships offer hands-on experience and are a great way to get started in this field. On the flip side of legislation, there's regulation. Once the laws are passed, how are they actually implemented? Often, policies don't contain enough detail for governments to adequately enforce the laws, so we need experts within the government to help write the regulations that protect our health, safety, and environment. This applies at the state, federal, and even international levels. Think World Health Organization. Regulatory agencies, like the US EPA or state-level EPA equivalents, are where most of these careers reside. Given that regulations cover a wide breadth of issues, from medicine to space travel to air pollution, no matter what your expertise, there is likely a role for you to play in informing regulations. Speaking of the international level, you can also explore careers in diplomacy or international development, which usually means working for a federal agency like the State Department, the Foreign Service, or an international organization like the UN. Navigating the scientific details of treaties and agreements between countries is an important role for scientists who are interested in foreign policy. Program management is the glue that holds science policy together, without which nothing much would get done. These jobs focus on how decisions involving science are being made, how funding is distributed, and how these programs function. This is a broad category, but a lot of the positions in federal government and at third-party organizations, like scientific societies, think tanks, and philanthropic organizations, have some component of program management. Working in science policy doesn't mean you have to give up doing research. Think tanks and nonprofits often act as the bridge between research and policymaking, and government agencies often need analysts with strong critical thinking and problem-solving skills to address both specific and broad issues. And of course, there are opportunities to work on advocacy, taking action in support of a specific cause or proposal. Nonprofits, think tanks, and philanthropic foundations in this space work on issues like improving access to clean water, increasing clean energy distribution, increasing funding for STEM education, and more. Some scientific societies also have staff who work on these issues. Depending on where you end up, having strong science communication, relationship building, project management, and collaboration skills may be relevant. Finally, you could step into the political realm and work for a candidate or an elected official or run for office yourself. Working on science policy doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing path. You can integrate aspects of science policy into your work by building relationships with your elected officials as an expert resource, doing policy-relevant work you share with different audiences, engaging through your professional society, and building a culture within your institution that embraces policy and other types of engagement. To learn more about the National Society of Black Engineers Public Policy Special Interest Group,
Awesome. Thank you. I just wanted to give that broad overview of all of the different ways that you can engage in science policy. And as it highlighted at the end, there are ways to do this that don't mean an entire career shift. You can build relationships with decision makers in a volunteer capacity. And we can talk more about what that looks like later. But without further ado, I now
Working in
want to
science
hand it over to Jorge, who's going to talk a little bit about his career path. So take it away.
Thank you very much, Melissa. That was a great video to outline where I can fit in, right? So I first want to introduce myself. So my name is Jorge Jimenez, and I am a biomedical or bioengineer. And I wanted to share a little bit more of my background that explains how I leveraged my scientific skill sets into science advocacy. So I earned my biomedical engineering degree from Arizona State University. And then I made the transition to a PhD program at the University of Pittsburgh. And I earned my PhD in 2021. And I currently work for Becton Dickinson and Company as a senior engineer within a material science group. And at the same time, I am a founder of my LLC that I represent as myself. So I call this the Mayan Bioengineer. And I am disclosing that I am speaking on my individual capacity and not Becton Dickinson, and that I am the owner of Mayan Bioengineer. And so I want to just express that my career trajectory is one that rides many different lines in different areas. And so I've always been an engineer who likes to think of things a little bit more holistically. And so one of the ways that I felt really connected to was engaging in SACNAS. So when I was in my PhD work, I had moved from Southwestern Arizona to Southwestern Pennsylvania, where my culture and my Latin American community was not really present. So I ended up finding SACNAS. So if we go to the next slide, I went to the SACNAS in 2019 in Hawaii to present on my research. And I met a wonderful group of engineers and scientists who also felt really connected to the inclusion practices of SACNAS. And so I had a poster presentation on some of the work that I contributed to. And this included creating novel drug formulations in a form of an eye drop to treat a rare eye disease called cystinosis. So I am mostly a bioengineer who utilized material science and chemical engineering fundamentals and translated that work into a technology that could perhaps improve the lives of a patient. So that's kind of how a biomedical engineer or bioengineer works, is we sort of invent and develop new technologies that we then try to impact people's lives with. So I felt very connected to this. And at SACNAS, I had been a lab rat, right? Very lab heavy, and still engaged with community, but not quite. And if we go to the next slide, I sat in on a talk that was called "It Takes All of Us to Keep Us Well, Engaging in Transdisciplinary and Community Engaged Research to Reduce Health Disparities in Our Communities." And I got to meet Dr. Kathy Samayoa from San Francisco State University. And she spoke to her research as a biologist, where she was working with Latina farm workers in California to determine their stress level and relating that to cortisol levels using her scientific lab at San Francisco State University. And this was the first time that I seen the word community engaged or community participatory research. And I had no idea that scientists were actively working in communities. And this sort of changed my trajectory, and just I started really aligning myself to my own identities and how I can further impact my community. So if we go to the next slide, I want to just introduce myself again as not only am I an engineer, but who's this like wet lab scientist, but I was really motivated by my lived experience to get to where I'm at. So I am a first generation college and graduate student, and I'm a first generation Guatemalan American, and my parents are of Mayan descent. And so I grew up in a household that spoke Mayan languages, Spanish and English. And I also identify as someone of the LGBTQI community. And so I had always had these identities that carried me through this. And as I was studying in my PhD program, I was sort of losing sight of this, right? I was really in the lab, in the weeds of developing this new eye drop. And I went to SACNAS and I was further invigorated by work by Dr. Kathy Samayoa and the awesome connections at SACNAS where I could really present myself of who I was and who I am. And towards the end of my PhD, I had the opportunity to start engaging in more science policy work. So if we go to the next slide, I had mentored these very awesome undergraduates through a program called Pitt Excel, which is the undergraduate diversity program at the University of Pittsburgh. And they were some hungry and very strong leaders at the time of their undergraduate program, and they brought to this science policy competition led by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, and they were looking for a mentor to help them guide them through writing a science policy memo. And none of us had ever done this. I had never written science policy. I had never heard of JSPG, but I did see that their outreach partners included SACNAS, the National Society of Black Engineers, who I trusted a lot. So we wrote a policy memo and we were able to get published in this. And so I won't speak to this a lot, but it's entitled Defining the Race and Ethnic Standards for Federal Statistics and Administrative Reporting that advocates for a new definition of race from a sociologic standpoint to be included within statistics reporting through the Office of Budget Management in the US. And so I wanted to share this piece and this connection to SACNAS to just illustrate that I was able to use my graduate experience to help mentor people and write a technical piece that's related to science policy. And that from this intersectional perspective, we were able to come together and write a successful memo. So if we go to the next slide, I kind of piggyback off of that video where there are many pathways to science policy. And while my career is not directly rooted in policy, or even as a graduate student, it still contributes to that framework of science policy. So policy memo competitions could be an opportunity where you get to practice a flavor of your academic skill sets, your mentorship skill sets, and your writing skill sets, all within your technical skill sets of science. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to highlight that as a medical technology engineer, when I was interviewing for positions, I absolutely put this on my resume, and I kind of put this slide as why do medical technologies care about this. I was able to show that I had an extra publication, that I was able to communicate to broad audiences. I was able to navigate publicly available databases. I proved my technical writing through policy. And this was a unique example of working with a cross-collaborative team. And ultimately, this showed leadership beyond the lab, beyond what I was contributing as a technical researcher. And to sort of round things out, as an engineer within this medical technology field and as a consultant, I'm still impacted by policy. So if we go to the next slide, I am continuously observing policy and how this shapes my career trajectory in the medical field and in my STEM consulting business as the Mayan bioengineer. So I highlighted a few pieces. One is the FDA Modernization Act that is pushing for less animal testing and using in vitro or cellular organoid or lab on a chip devices to receive FDA approval of technologies. And on the other hand, I currently live in Utah, and there's been a push for increasing funding for teacher salaries and optional education opportunities where there's a STEM component and areas to which I could perhaps help work with public education and aligning more equitable opportunities in science, technology, engineering, and math. So I kind of round out I work as an engineer and this consulting business that I have, but I'm absolutely continuing to advocate for science, whether that's through education or in the medical device field. And so I will pass on to someone who is more rooted in policy as within their career. So Albert, take it away.
Thank you, Jorge, and hello, everyone. It's tough to follow Jorge on that, but I will do my best. My name is Albert Hinman. I'm a policy fellow sponsored by the American Society of Human Genetics and the National Human Genome Research Institute. Though today I'm going to be speaking in my own personal capacity, and these views do not necessarily represent those of my employers or past employers. So I was charged today to discuss different activities you can do as either an undergraduate or graduate student to get involved with science policy and advocacy, either if that's just to try it out or really embark towards it potentially as a career. Now, there's quite a bit to unpack on this, but before we get into all of that, I'll just give a very quick rundown of who I am and my background. Again, my name is Albert. Culturally, I'm a mixed race Chicano with many different cultural touchstones across the world from an upbringing in a military family. My education is mostly in the sciences. I have an undergraduate degrees in biology and nanoscience from Virginia Tech and a PhD in genetics from Stanford University. Now, it's important to say at most, during my undergraduate and graduate school years, I thought I was just going to be a researcher or scientist for life. That was my original pursuit. But then I discovered the world of policy and how much fun, intellectually engaging, and just how absolutely wonderful it is. But before I try to convince you of all of how fun that world is, when I was a researcher and a student, that included things like being an activist, and included things like being a SACNAS chapter officer, a colleague to many of my peers and fellow researchers, a husband to an amazing wife. That's still true. All those are still true, and a friend of many. Right now, though, I'm doing a fellowship which is designed to take subject matter experts, in my case, genetics for my PhD, and this fellowship program places them in government to help inform different decisions that are made. Now, Jorge and Melissa both discussed a lot about the different roles and professions that could perform policy and advocacy. But I wanted to take some time a little bit before this to discuss something foundationally important that Melissa also brought up in her early remarks. Because I think when science policy and advocacy are introduced as an idea, there's sort of this logical disconnect that begins to form up in our heads as we begin to think about it. Now, if we go back to our education, K through 12 undergraduate courses, you are taught that practicing the scientific method is objective. That the scientific method is a structure of systematic inquiry to generate truths about our universe through observation, experimentation, and testing of theories against evidence. So why are myself and these wonderful folks here talking about politics, talking about policy and advocacy? I want to emphasize that your training is correct. We're not here to attack the scientific method with all those things. But when we say things like science is political, we're not talking about the method of exercising science, but we're pointing out that our stewardship, our management, our decisions about how science is structured and our different institutions have many subjective political decisions embedded within them. making it inherently political at how it affects society. So take, for example, these questions, which I'm very sure many of you have asked before when you look at STEM broadly. Why is the demographic composition of scientists dominated by certain genders or cultural groups? And what can we do with programming investment to change that and have that composition better reflect our local communities? When we're using the US tax dollars to invest in research topics, how do we prioritize what to invest in? Should that be climate change? Should it be cancer therapies, rare diseases, health inequities, sustainable water technology, artificial intelligence, quantum, nanotech, agriculture? Maybe just basic research simply towards the goal of chasing an endless frontier of discovery. How do we weigh safety, ethics, and societal considerations in our research? Should scientists and engineers be better informed about safety, ethics, and social issues as they go into research? And what do we do with that knowledge that we uncover? As a country, should we share that knowledge with the world with no charge at all? Do we keep bits of strategic information with ourselves? Do we act intentionally and immediately with that knowledge to help address the inequities of the world? Science policy and advocacy is a profession that seeks to answer and operationalize answers to those very difficult questions and help implement them through different other avenues. And if you're like me, you look at STEM and you have many subjective definitions and questions for this incredibly objective space. I want to emphasize that science policy and advocacy is a place where those identities, those values you have are absolutely essential for giving some of those answers and giving them a voice and helping create a world that we all think is better. So transitioning out of that, I want to talk about certain actions you could do as a student and helping prepare and give you some on-the-ground experiences for moving into a career like that. And of course, we have a limited time to go over so many of these. So I want to emphasize that we do have a handout, will be a companion later in the presentation that you could reference, and please don't feel the need to immediately jot down all the notes. But one is student organization leadership. The most important thing I can mention that SACNAS as a national organization has dedicated over 40 years to fostering diversity in STEM and inform public policies that support a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive scientific landscape. By simply being a part of SACNAS and participating in different chapter activities, you're being a part of that movement. You know, those same missions that SACNAS pursues is also very important right now for our federal government agencies, which are broadly seeking to include populations of people who have historically not been part of the STEM enterprise. And so when you're participating in these SACNAS activities, you're getting a real firsthand view into what sort of programs and what sort of investments are really needed to create a more equitable science ecosystem. And as well as see how science, mathematics, engineering can actually help our local communities. So in short, keeping involved with SACNAS, also try not to overburden Daniela, but I'll say talk to Daniela if you're interested, and also some of the big priority efforts and some of the national committee efforts. She would love to talk to you about it too. A second is actually doing research for policy. So as Melissa mentioned earlier in the conversation, there are a lot of different research areas that heavily inform policy. Think of things such as climate change studies, efforts of rare diseases, some economics of how we can afford different things, sustainable energy, and so forth. Now, some of the institutions you come from have laboratories. You can actually volunteer and simply be a researcher and help produce the objective facts and information that help inform policy. And for those of you who may not have those laboratories at your institutions, there are programs such as the National Science Foundation Research Experience for Undergraduates. You can type NSF-REU, the acronym, into Google search. And those are actual programs that will pay you to over a summer to go work at an institution in a laboratory in different designated fields. But you can simply be doing research in a laboratory that helps generate these different facts and information, very important for policy. The third is internships and micro experiences. And I want to point out that many of you are already pursuing and dedicating a lot of time into science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and are trying to figure out how to take that expertise you're cultivating now and then move it into policy. I think the broad note I'll point out is that there are many different academic societies and nonprofit organizations, such as the American Society of Human Genetics, that offer different certificate or small kind of small resource intensive programs that can give you some crash courses in advocacy and policy. And it really leverages your identity as a scientist and trying to bring that out to further different things. Number 4 is education, and that's going a bit beyond some of the most crash course experiences, but actually giving you a lot more academic theory, especially that in public policy, to really formulate different ideas. Now, if you're fortunate to be at a school with a policy program, you should, at a very first step, just see if there's any interesting courses in government, politics, etc., and simply audit, sit in on it, see if you like it. Occasionally, a few of these programs also have a master's degree or even credentialed certificates you can pursue. What I would say is like these courses give a very strong foundational training for economics, policy writing, politics, government, and ethics that can give you the academic grounding to really think and leverage a deep, nuanced thinking about policy. And I know I'm running out of time, but the last point I'll lead off is the direct policy and advocacy experience. So I think it's really important to know that a lot of SACNAS members I've interacted with over the years, you guys are already doing advocacy and policy at either your communities, throughout your schools. I think simply being a part of SACNAS is even kind of being a part of this larger advocacy goals and everything else. What I want to say is that you are having on the ground experience right now that is very valuable. And beyond interacting with your chapter, there's also opportunities likely on your doorstep you can be involved with. If you're right now a resident in the United States, of course, we have our 50 states, we have state governments. Each state government has a representative in your local district and area. Interacting with that office, getting to know them. You're one of the citizens in their area. They love to meet you. They often actually have coffee open house hours. You should definitely feel free to meet them. And there's also, of course, nonprofits such as the Union of Concerned Scientists, who have a lot of really powerful programs, such as their team-based organizing initiative, which can actually give a lot of your key training in advocacy and policy and have you interact with local science advocates to advocate for things such as your community's health, policy, and environment. And now with the limited time, we can't get into all the topics, but I want to heavily encourage it is that as we go into these different breakout rooms, Jorge and I, we want to cover everything, but we have a limited amount of time. And we saw some of the questions you've had, and they are quite simply very detailed, very amazing. And we encourage you to ask them to us. If it's something completely off base from what we presented or something forward, please interact with us. We thought they were great questions, and we look forward to talking with you all. So I'll transition now back to Melissa and Daniela. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Albert. And thank you, Jorge. We have time for a couple questions in the chat before we head into smaller discussions in a type of breakout room. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. And then just so you all know what to expect, we are going to continue the Q&A and the conversation in breakout rooms with Jorge and Albert separately, and then Daniela and I will also be available if you have questions about our organizations. But I see some questions coming in. So Marlene asks, what are some opportunities in science policy and advocacy for DACA or undocumented students? Albert or Jorge, do either of you want to take that?
So later on, I'll share a little bit of a slide for SACNAS 2023, where my cousin and I and our other leader will be presenting on work. And so my cousin actually works for a nonprofit, and she actually has DACA status. And so she works in Portland, working with Indigenous communities with access to housing and environmental justice. So The nonprofit sector actually is an opportunity to be employed, whether you have US citizenship status or not. So please reach out to me. And if you want to have a more targeted conversation about that, I'd be happy to connect you with someone who has BACA and is working in this space. So maybe more in the career side of things, but in the policy side, I'm not sure. Albert, do you have anything, or Melissa?
I think probably just echoing what Jorge said. And then two, I think it is definitely trying to look into some of these issues that you think really need voices from that community and advocating for them. And there are millions of nonprofits out there, each of them dedicated to different issues. I think Jorge had hit the right note with that. And also I think exactly also what Jorge said, talk to people, ask these questions. We, each of us have contacts, and I think a lot of it is just trying to find the right person who cares about what you care about too. And then eventually sort of identifying what's the right niche thing for you and advancing forward with that.
Awesome. I want to try to keep us on track. So I see the other questions in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you. There will be time for them. So I wanted to offer just a quick tip before we head into breakout groups on the next slide. And this is how to think about which pathway might be best for you. And this is a tool called asset mapping. And if you're not sure where to get started, you can use this to help figure out, which path might be right for you. So there are 3 questions that you can start with. First, what connections do you already have on your campus, in your community, in your personal and professional networks? Jorge and Albert both touched on this, that like SACNAS is such an amazing place to get started, finding out what committee and chapter opportunities are available. So start with who and what you know. How much time do you have? And be honest about this. If you only have 2 hours a month, don't sign up to run a new organization. This will save you a lot of grief in the long run. And finally, and most importantly, what motivates you? Other than a particular issue you might want to work on, are there other things that you want to gain, like new skills, new friends? Do you want to take on a leadership role? It's okay to think about what you want to get out of engaging, because if you find it more rewarding, you're likely to stay involved over the long run. So just be upfront about that. All right, so with that in mind, we're going to head into our version of breakout rooms, which will be separate Zoom rooms because we had some technical issues. So Jorge will be in room 1. Albert will be in the Zoom 2. And Daniela and I are going to stay here in the main room if you have questions about UCS or SACNAS. And I believe my colleague, Sarah Goodspeed, is actually going to help out with Albert. Thank you, Sarah. And then Angel, Daniela's colleague, is going to help out with Jorge. So feel free to head over to those Zoom rooms, and then we will come back at 6 till the hour with some of those final resources and action opportunities to wrap up. Sorry, so I will see you all back here at 6 till the hour, and feel free to head into whichever Zoom space feels like the right fit for you. But since Albert mentioned the team-based organizing initiative, that's one that I'm personally, it's one of my favorites. We started it about 5 years ago, and this is a leadership development, like 1-year program, really focused on helping people figure out how to organize local advocacy opportunities with other groups of science advocates who are passionate about local issues. And we offer coaching, trainings. We host a virtual summit every year. There's mini grant funding if you want to organize events but need some support. So it really is pretty in-depth. And if you're serious about getting involved in advocacy, I recommend checking it out. I was going to post it in the chat, but I don't think I can send things to attendees. So we will make
should
sure
be.
you get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Melissa, it should be on if you switch the chat to say everyone. I think the default for you might say hosts and panelists, but if you click on it, there should
Yeah,
be
I can send
everyone
it to
below.
you,
Oh,
or I
weird.
can send it to hosts and panelists.
Okay.
If
You want to
that's
send it to
okay.
me and I can send it to everyone?
Sure.
Zoom just does not like me today. Or maybe this week.
Daniela, is there anything you're particularly excited about at the conference? Actually, maybe hold that. I see David's question in the chat.
Okay. Let's see. David, I don't have access to my microphone, no worries. I've been a member for a couple of years and have been wanting to do more to increase accessibility and opportunities in my community. That's awesome. I have also been active in my student council and was recently elected, congrats, to a stateside position in the Student Senate of California Community Colleges. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And would like to bring more SACNAS representation to our regional and board trainings. That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I think being a member, one of the benefits is having kind of this year-round uh, community of members. We're at over 9,000 at this point. And so there's a couple different ways that you might want to share information. You can share it nationally through the member platform. We have a site specifically where we kind of curate different opportunities, and it would be great to have some information there. The other is really chapters, and Albert touched on this. So David, I'm not sure if you're part of a chapter or if you've looked into finding a SACNAS chapter near you, but there are about 144 across the country at many different institutions, lots in California, if I think, yep, you're in California, so tons in California, many at community colleges, and I think they would definitely be interested as well, and just kind of hearing more about what this opportunity entails and kind of what you're thinking in terms of representation, whether that's students or professional members or SACNA staff or volunteers as well. Let's see, I'm not in a chapter. I live south of Salinas. Oh, awesome. You're nearby. I'm in Santa Cruz, California. So I would have to look at the map, but we do have resources on our website, and maybe I'll put the link on the chat. The closest chapter to you is going to be not too far. They are mostly at institutions, college campuses, but they're always looking for ways to collaborate, ways to connect. So just because you might not necessarily attend that institution doesn't mean you don't you can't reach out or ask some questions connecting with them. And then I see a follow-up. I was thinking if SACNAS was interested in attending and giving presentations on upcoming trainings. Yeah, absolutely. I'll put my email in the chat as well. Maybe we can talk more specifically what you're thinking. But any chance to really spread the word is very much appreciated. So I'm going to put both my email and our chapter website in the chat. Thank you, David. And then I'm putting in the link from Melissa that she mentioned. I've heard wonderful things. I'm putting this one in the chat as well for the team-based organizing.
Thanks, Daniela.
Absolutely. Let's see, were there any questions in Q&A that are not for Jorge or Albert? I don't think so. Oh, Kenzo. Okay, one moment. All right, you're up.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the super interesting panel. I had a question about, so I'm in the 5th year of my PhD program in environmental science, and I've gone straight through from undergrad to a master's in ecology to my PhD program, and am super interested, and at this point, wanting to get out of academia, but have only ever known academia. And I've started to look at positions, and I would love to work for a group like UCS or any kind of science policy advocacy realm. And I'm just, as I'm looking at job positions, it feels often like the things that I'm seeing are like, oh, maybe you need a bachelor's and some work experience. And I'm just curious about like breaking into the non-academic or policy advocacy realm and how I might like pitch myself or what I might be doing in like the next year to better position myself to be a competitive applicant for something that where I might have to, yeah, just like pitch myself a little bit differently because I don't have that type of job experience. And I have been in school for my entire life. Thank you.
Totally. Yeah, I think there's a lot that you can do around framing the skills that you have already been building in the lab and throughout your education, just to think about how they can be transferable outside of academia. So clearly, writing is one of them. Writing for policy is a little bit different, as I think Jorge and Albert both alluded to, but that's something that you can also practice. The Journal for Science Policy and Governance exclusively publishes early career scientists pieces. So that's a great way to, find an opportunity that is excited to publish grad students' papers and gives you an opportunity to practice with them as well. They do a lot of writing workshops. So learning to transition that skill to being a little bit more policy forward in your writing and other types of communication. Looking for ways just to volunteer your time to learn more about local community groups, what they're working on, and seeing if there are ways that your research or even your academic connections can support some of their work, I think is a really great way to build on the ground experience and understand the policy making sphere a little bit better. Think of a few other options. And I mean, joining organizations like UCS and SACNAS that provide opportunities to take action, sign petitions and letters, meet your members of Congress and start building those connections with decision makers, I think is really invaluable. So starting with, the organizations that you already have connections to, if you have another professional society that you're connected with, they often do Hill Days or go to DC for trips to meet with members of Congress. And that could be another opportunity that you can highlight on your resume. These volunteer experiences do count for a lot in science policy because it's still an emerging career field. There's like no one way to work in science policy. Everyone's sort of coming from very different perspectives. So sorry, that was a lot, but I'm also happy to chat offline. If you want to run some ideas by me, I will send my email to Daniela and send it to you. Also, I didn't introduce my background at the beginning. I'm not a scientist. I just train scientists to get involved in advocacy, but I work with scientists at UCS. We have trained researchers on staff. So if you'd rather talk with someone who's coming from a similar background, I'd be happy to put you in contact with my colleagues as well. And with that, I think folks will be coming back, hopefully, to our room soon. But Daniela, was there anything you're excited about at SACNAS right now that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think top of mind for sure is our conference. We are a couple months away, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but to add that it is our 50th anniversary. And so, I mean, it's always a special conference, especially coming out of the pandemic. We're super happy to be back in person. But not only to be back in person, but now to celebrate 50 years. And so we're celebrating just like how much we've grown in the last 50 years, especially the last kind of half 15-ish years. And so again, Albert mentioned chapters. We're at the largest number of chapters we've ever had, the largest number of members we've ever had, and finding ways to really celebrate that at the conference. We're going to have the largest exhibit hall we've ever had. Everything's just big and exciting, but all the things that stay the same with every conference, the culture components, the community, networking, the mentoring, the feeling of celebration. I'm just really excited to get to Portland and to see everyone again. Long time attendees and new as well. We always have a large number of new or first timers, and excited to welcome them into SACNAS. What about you?
Yeah, I'm super excited for the conference too. I have been meeting with some of my colleagues who will be joining me for the first time at the conference.
Oh, yes.
I'm helping out with 2 workshops, so there will definitely be a lot of science policy discussions happening at the conference that I'm really excited about. But the fall is always such a busy time for UCS. We're really kicking off a lot of exciting work. I mentioned team-based organizing, but the Science for Public Good Fund, which is our mini grants opportunity, also launches at the end of September. And we're already thinking about 2024 and elections and ways to increase voter turnout among STEM students. So all of those things are starting to kick off.
So I had 2 questions. One was from a graduate student, and they were really interested in how to leverage your research writing skills into writing for science policy in the policy memo that I shared. And I answered that by kind of saying like 3 main points was having a good team that is really passionate about this and being able to work with them, and if they are of different disciplines, to utilize that. So we worked with the sociologist Renee, and that was really, really helpful to help us understand that side of the policy that we were advocating for. And then the second thing was I kind of talked about the asset mapping, was look for the resources that you're most connected to, whether that is SACNAS or something like National Society for Black Engineers, and just start doing that early. And then the third, sort of more for the graduate student, was if you end up wanting to work with undergraduates to write something, think of yourself as the principal investigator of your mini lab, and how you would delegate, how your PI perhaps delegates writing a scientific article. Use that, wear that little hat for your team. Like perhaps you delegate specific sections and then you are more of an editor, or you do more of the paperwork to submit, right? Like think about where maybe you're more of on a management level. And the second question and connection was was from an institute out of San Diego State University that supports Latina students at Hispanic serving institutes, and they were asking me how to also get students connected to writing for policy memos, and because of the connection to the Hispanic Serving Institute, I said that this kind of starts a little bit earlier before doing the writing. It's about getting that passion behind. And I just shared how I'm very passionate about my engagement in science and science policy by my family's diaspora, as someone who identifies as Latina, like understanding the reasons why my family moved to the United States, the policies that drove that, and like how that aligns to current policies that affects communities. So as an example, my parents were farm workers in southwestern Arizona and moved from Guatemala during the Civil War through asylum. And I understand now there are still farm workers' rights and issues that they face that perhaps students at SDSU feel connected to, but maybe there's a familial aspect of it that gives them that motivation to start digging into that policy and beginning to write about it.
Oh, that sounds like such a great conversation. Thank you for sharing that, Jorge. And that was the whole point of this webinar, was to have a little bit more of a conversation. I know we're already over time. Albert, was there a key takeaway from your Zoom room that you wanted to share?
They're all wonderful questions, and I think a lot of it was, I think, chase the path and do the opportunities and that make the most sense for you, for sure. And that each path into science policy looks different. And if something doesn't sound like you, don't do it. But if it does, go do it. And maybe you might be the first to apply that activity and to go into policy or that domain. But I think if anything, it's just reinforcing this idea. Use your identity, talk to people you love and who know you, and do stuff that makes sense for you. That's how you're chasing into this vocation.
Love it. All right, Daniela, are we ready for some rapid fire final recommendations and resources? Okay.
Absolutely.
Here's the link to the resources we promised you, and we will send this over email, but it's a bit.ly, and it's a roundup of ways you can continue to get involved, continue to learn more, and references a lot of the links and organizations that we've referenced throughout this presentation. I also want to briefly highlight a few action opportunities from UCS. There's a letter that you can sign to support agricultural research funding to help address climate change. I've already talked about team-based organizing. You can get involved in student voter registration and voter turnout through Science Rising. Our next training is September 19th. And finally, my colleague Sarah Goodspeed is organizing a climate litigation webinar series. We didn't really get to talk about the litigation side of science policy at all, but this is an exciting emerging field where scientists can get involved, especially on the climate science front. So if you want to learn more about that, the webinar starts September 26th. And finally, I think Daniela.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you everyone for your wonderful talks. It's really cool to see people engaging as well. So if you are in the audience today and you enjoyed today's discussion, there's lots more opportunities, like Melissa said, to really continue the conversation. And I want to highlight a few of those because we are hoping you will join us at the upcoming conference this October. It is the National Diversity in STEM Conference hosted by SACNAS. I think everyone on the screen will be there this October in Portland. We're going to have some incredible keynote speakers, a huge graduate school and career expo, cultural celebrations, and many amazing sessions, including some from us here today. So I did want to give you each a moment. Jorge, if you want to just introduce your session real quick.
Yeah, so I have a stacked lineup to present an engineering lens for innovation and design with Black and Indigenous communities. And we have Renee, who helped author that policy memo from the sociology side. My cousin, but also amazing leader, Malene Jimenez, who works in Portland with Indigenous communities. And then myself, who will be moderating and doing an exercise in innovation. So excited to be there.
Excellent. And then we have some UCS sessions, Melissa.
Yeah, on Thursday afternoon, we will have a session on science and advocacy at the local level. So really focusing in on how to get involved in your communities. And then Saturday, unfortunately, I think at the same time as Jorge's, we have a workshop on science and social justice. So we can also share resources on those separately. Plus, we will be in the exhibit hall, so please stop by and grab some swag. I would love to meet you in person.
Excellent. Thank you both. So yes, registration is open. You can save by becoming a member or registering before September 30th. So if you can't make it to this year's conference, though we hope you do, please still consider becoming a member. We have information, events, resources happening year-round. We have a national community of over 9,000 members, future conferences, year-round programs, online resources, and more webinars like this. So finally, we really appreciate it if you'd like to leave some feedback on today's webinar and suggestions for future ones in this topic. We can dive a little deeper. You can scan the QR code showing on your screen, or when the webinar concludes, it will pop up for you automatically. So thank you very much for taking a few minutes to answer those questions. Thank you very much to Jorge, Albert, and Melissa for being with us today. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day.